Buenas tardes, good afternoon to all. My name is Carlos Vargas Ramos. I am the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños Director of Public Policy, External and Media Relations and Development. I often serve as host and masters of ceremonies for our webinars. However, this afternoon, I will be one of the presenters of this event, which is entitled, as you know, Legislative Redistricting, Challenges to Hispanic Congressional Representation in New York State 2021. I nevertheless wanted to discharge, Camacho, next slide. I nevertheless wanted to discharge some of my duties as host and indicate to you that the event this evening or this afternoon is another collective effort that is being co-sponsored by LatinoJustice-PRLDEF. Therefore, joining us in the program are Juan Cartagena and Fulvia Vargas de Leon from Latino Justice, who will be presenting on the intricacies of the redistricting process. In addition, we are joined by representatives of the government institutions in New York State that have a direct involvement in the redistricting process. We have Assemblymember Robert Rodriguez, who, in addition to being an Assembly member, and as a result of being an Assembly member, he's co-chair of the New York State Legislative Task Force on Demographic Research and Reapportionment, as well as Dr. Ibelis Cuevas Molina, who is commissioner of the New York Independent Redistricting Commission. I also wanted to mention that the report that serves as the basis of our presentation this afternoon is available to the public in the same page you used to register for this webinar, as well as in the Center for Puerto Rican Studies main page, centropr.hunter.cuny.edu. While we have many panelists this evening, the audience will still have an opportunity to engage in the ensuing discussion. Panelists will be answering questions from the audience submitted to us using the Q&A function in Zoom. Please take note that while Zoom offers a chat function, the questions that will be fielded will be those in the Zoom Q&A function, not the chat. The Q&A function is located at the bottom strip of the Zoom screen. These questions will be fielded to the panelists by this afternoon's moderator, Lucia Gomez, Political Director of the New York City Central Labor Council. Finally, gracias, Jose. Finally, we are often asked in this webinar we are often asked if this webinar is being recorded and available for viewing later on. The answer is yes. You will be able to find this webinar and all of our previous webinars in the same page you used to register for this webinar, centropr.nationbuilder.com. To start us off this afternoon, I would like to call on Centro's Director, Dr. Edwin Melendez, to give us welcoming remarks. Adelante, Edwin.
Gracias, Carlos. Saludos a todos y todas. Welcome to the webinar. Today, we focus on one of the most critical political issues following the decennial census, the redistricting of congressional and local electoral districts, an issue with great implications for the Puerto Rican and Latino community in New York State. First, I would like to thank LatinoJustice-PRLDEF for their co-sponsorship of this event. I would also like to thank all the panelists for their participation, Juan Cartagena and Fulvia Vargas de Leon from Latino Justice, Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez, and Dr. Ibelis Cuevas Molina. This is the first of many upcoming activities for Centro to provide data and to facilitate the analysis of this critical question. For those of you who have not yet visited our web pages, I encourage you to do so. In our website, you can find many recent webinars on critical topics concerning Puerto Rico's recovery and the impact on the stateside Puerto Rican community. In particular, we have developed a GIS web application where we make data available about Puerto Rican organizations, elected officials, demographic and socioeconomic conditions in the diaspora. We're already working on a dashboard where you can use 2020 census data to simulate redistricting options and the impact on the Puerto Rican representation in your state, the topic that we're discussing today. You will be able to use all the data presented by Carlos in his redistricting study to assess proposed or potential redistricting options and their impact on our communities. We will offer tutorials and training to activists who can use this tool to empower local communities. Stay tuned. Thanks to all of you for participating in this important event. I would like now to introduce the moderator for this event. Lucia Gomez is the political director of the New York City Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO. Prior to joining the New York Central Labor Council, Lucia was the director of organizing a strategic partnership for Local 78. Lucia has been engaged in census and redistricting work since 1999. She first served as LatinoJustice-PRLDEF East Coast Latino Voting Rights Project Director, and later as a policy fellow with the National Institute for Latino Policy. Lucia, please take over.
Thank you very much, Edwin, and thank you, Carlos, for starting us off. I want to thank all the panelists that are here with us today. This is exciting. I have to admit, redistricting is just one of those things that cheers me up in the mornings, believe it or not. You know, fun fact about me, aside from having started straight out of college at Latino Justice-PRLDEF, then the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, is that, you know, I didn't know anything about census or about redistricting. And, you know, then our late friend, Angelo Falcon, rest in peace, he asked me to take on this, you know, do census, you know, you have a good, you know, outreach. And I was like just a natural organizer. And Angelo introduced me to Juan Cartagena, who's our next speaker. And just a little fun fact is that in 2000, I want to say 6, I decided that I wanted to have a child. And knowing that I couldn't, I took a look at my timeline because I had, my daughter was in vitro. And so I had a chance to plan it all out. And I said, well, hold on a second. I know planning for census has already started. And if I just make sure that I have my daughter with enough time, then I'll be ready for 2010 census and then following up redistricting. And lo and behold, it actually worked out quite well. She was born in 2007. And I had a good almost 2 years time to be with her. So I say that to say that this is something that is of huge importance and magnitude to the Latino community, but to all communities, because it is the fundamental basis for how we build on our electoral system, our democratic system. And I am really proud to introduce our next presenter, Juan Cartagena. He's not only a constitutional civil rights attorney, he is the president and general counsel of Latino Justice-PRLDEF, the Juan Cartagena that leads Latino Justice-PRLDEF. So thank you very much, Juan, and it's your show.
Hello, I'm Juan Cartagena, president and general counsel of Latino Justice-PRLDEF, and I'll be providing some historical perspectives on redistricting from a Latinx perspective. Redistricting in New York from Latinx historical perspectives. To start understanding the relationship between redistricting in New York, we have to start at actually Puerto Rican activism in New York City, across the board. Progressive political activism in Puerto Rican communities between the 2 world wars in the mid-1990s were very, very robust. About 36 vibrant political associations resulted in a voter registration rate of about 50% of the Puerto Rican population in New York City in the mid-1900s, which is significant at that time. Vito Macaltonio Congress in East Harlem, Oscar Garcia Rivera Assembly Rep in East Harlem, and in Manbadillo Congress in Bronx of 1971. Each of these 3 were made historical milestones. My next name for you is Nidia Velazquez, who was elected to Congress in Brooklyn, New York, and Queens counties in 1992. So Vito Macaltonio was considered probably the first Puerto Rican congressman, even though he was Italian. It was because of his adamant, steadfast support for independence of Puerto Rico and for many causes for working class Puerto Ricans. Oscar Garcia Rivera made history as the first elected official from Puerto Rico in the history of the United States. Herman Badillo made history as the first elected congressperson to be elected in the history of the United States of Puerto Rican ancestry. Each of those 3 individuals, however, did not get their victories because of redistricting battles. In fact, they represent districts in which the concentration of Puerto Rican and other Latino voters was so high that literally no matter how the district would have looked, it would have been a majority Latino district. Nida Velazquez is the exception. So Nida Velazquez is a person who was only able to win after a redistricting battle. So her district, which covers 3 counties, is actually a better sign of how we have to deal with redistricting coming forward in this decade and beyond. In the 1970s, we had a false start. We thought we were going to get ready for redistricting battles in the Latino community. We could not because of the timing of some laws that were passed by Congress. First of all, in 1970, the redistricting cycle was the first time we had the 1965 Voting Rights Act, a significant piece of legislation in the history of civil rights. Section 2, which requires opportunity to elect, an equal opportunity to elect, today it still stands. It requires an analysis to make sure that you have enough members of a particular voting bloc to control a compact district, and that same voters, those group of voters, also suffer from the worst effects of racially polarized voting, because white voters typically vote against their candidates, and that they're politically cohesive so that they always consistently support the Latino Latinx preferred candidate. That Section 2 is still the law today. But it also, back in 1970s round of redistricting, we finally had Section 5, which prohibits discrimination because of intent or effect, but also prohibits it by requiring federal pre-clearance approval before an implementation. In 1971, Section 5 was first applied to New York, Bronx, and Kings County here in New York City, one of the few examples of Section 5's coverage outside of the Deep South. But New York State went to court immediately in 1971 to declare, and got a court to agree, that New York should not be subject to Section 5 because it did not use its literacy tests as a precondition for voting in New York State in a discriminatory manner. Back in the 1970s, you had to be literate in order to vote under New York constitutional law. The NAACP, however, went back to court after 1971 to reopen the case with the Department of Justice and convince them that, yes, there has been discriminatory use of literacy tests in New York City. And the answer for why or how is because it was an English-only literacy test which discriminated against Puerto Rican voters throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. As a result of that, in 1974, the court orders those three original counties, Bronx, New York, and Kings, to be covered by Section 5, biggest protection in the Voting Rights Act. Unfortunately, it was too late for the 1970s redistricting, but as we will see now, it became an issue in the 1980s. The Latino redistricting wars continued in the 1980s with really a lot of momentum. It was the first time that redistricting would be subject in New York City or New York State to Section 5 requirements. Who was the first Puerto Rican to sue under the Voting Rights Act in Section 5? Gilberto Gerena Valentin, a councilman from Bronx County, who was really annoyed and livid over the fact that New York City would not create additional Latino and Black districts of city council. Look at these numbers. In 1970 to 1980, Blacks and Latinos made up 47% of New York City's population total, and yet the city council for the 1980s redistricting plan only created 8 majority-minority districts out of 45, a ridiculous low number given the population growth from 70 to 80. New York tried to defend this by claiming there was amazing in New York City's residential housing patterns, which anyone who knows anything about New York in the 1970s knows and knew back then that was not true. Koch and the city council then went ahead and tried to hold their primaries for city without federal pre-clearance, which is what Section 5 requires. And that required then us, Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, and many other attorneys at the time that we were working with to go back to court and rush to court actually to stop the election. And we were able to stop the New York City primaries 2 days before the primary on September 8th. It was scheduled for September 10th. I would also know for those of you who study this that the 1980s rounds of redistricting in this particular case, Gerena Valentin versus Koch and Heron versus Koch, really formulated the basis of the New York City voting rights bar between Latino African-American attorneys who used the Voting Rights Act to success, and soon thereafter, very soon thereafter, Asian American attorneys as well. And all of us have been working on these issues for quite some time, since the 1980s. The 1980s also saw a big battle for creating a second congressional Latino district. These are not battles that just happened 10 years ago with Adriano Espaillat. They happened decades ago. The battle to create a second district was anchored in Brooklyn Historical District for Puerto Rican and Latino migration, said that they needed, they had the numbers to control a district and they were demanding one. Albany created a 45% Latino plurality district, but it linked Brooklyn with Loisaida in Manhattan and El Barrio in a very oddly configured district. That district was opposed by Representative Shirley Chisholm and also Senator Vander Beatty because it diminished Black voting strength in Brooklyn. The Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund submitted its own plan, which actually anchored the new district, the potential district in Brooklyn and Lower East Side only. But the Department of Justice actually eventually denied preclearance and rejected the plan for a second congressional district, finding that its effects in Brooklyn would be detrimental to Black voting strength in Kings County. As a result, Albany went back to the drawing board and created a 44% Latino plurality district, wholly cased in Brooklyn. And that eventually was pre-cleared, approved by the Department of Justice. So what happened? We should have gotten a second seat? No. Representative Ed Towns won that election. And why did he win a district that was about 44% Latino? Because two Latinos, Rafael Hernandez and Jack John Oliveto, decided to run against each other and split the primary vote, and therefore Mr. Towns won. In the 1990s, we went back, tried to create a second Latino congressional district, and this time in the 1990s, Latinos in Brooklyn, in Manhattan and Queens were able to elect the first Puerto Rican woman ever to be elected to Congress, Nidia Velázquez. One would think that was all good, right? Everything's fine. No. Diaz versus Silva was a lawsuit filed by a mix of white and Latino voters claiming that the plan that resulted in Nidia's district was a racial gerrymander. That is, that the primary purpose was based on race, to try to create a Latino district at the expense of other redistricting criteria. The court actually ruled that Latinos were not a community of interest, even when the community, no matter which borough they're at, was characterized by racially polarized voting. That is, they voted cohesively. The court actually ruled and accepted testimony from the plaintiffs in the case challenging Nidia's district that Colombians and Queens have nothing in common with Puerto Ricans and Lower East Side. And as a result, that community of interest, lack of community of interest, was another reason why the district had to be reconfigured. The court also made a reference to the fact that Asian Americans were a community of interest across these boroughs, linking the Chinatown of Sunset Park with the Chinatown of Manhattan in many ways. So a new plan was forced to be created. It had less Latino voters, and Nidia Velázquez won nonetheless. That district, her district, is still a plurality today, and it still encompasses more than one borough. The lessons here is that appearances matter. Whenever a district looks like it's too oddly configured to actually reach, and looks like it's going out of its way to reach Latino voters, it is suspect. The second lesson that we have to draw is that Nidia Velázquez enjoys both incumbency, a record of excellent voting in Congress, name recognition, and these are powerful tools to be reelected in any kind of context, including Congress. So the battle continued. Nidia's district was eventually created, but now the question is, can we create a third Latino congressional district? This battle was fought out last round of redistricting in 2010. And after the 2010 census, the Dominicans were demanding a district that was based in Washington Heights and Upper Manhattan, and also taking into account the Dominican migration into the Bronx County. That would pit, if you remember your history, the growing Latino Dominican vote in Manhattan and the Bronx against the seat of Black historic political power in New York City, and that is Central Harlem. And as we have seen, this issue became a major issue last time around in redistricting. Albany could not decide between the Republicans and the Democrats. They could not decide on a congressional plan. So what happens? They put their arms up in the air, said we can't figure it out. And LatinoJustice-PRLDEF and many other groups went to court to force a redistricting in time for the congressional primaries. That case, Favors versus Cuomo, included Latino voters that were able to intervene because of our efforts back then 10 years ago. A three-judge court was convened. A special master was was appointed to actually draw the lines. Remember, because Albany could not get it together between the Republicans and the Democrats. So what happens? Latino Justice proposed a plan to create a third congressional district that encompasses parts of Upper Manhattan along with the Bronx. And that was part of a unity plan presentation between Latino Justice-PRLDEF, the Center for Law and Social Justice out of Medgar Evers College, and the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Our unity plan would include a third congressional district. There was a competing plan. It attempted to try to create a district between New York County, Bronx County, and Queens, we thought that that competing plan would run some suspicions, just like other Nidas district 10 years before. So we proposed a 2-county plan. Eventually, the court adopted a 2-county plan, similar to what we proposed to the court and the special master, and created a New York and Bronx County 3rd congressional seat. Adriano Espaillat, to his credit, eventually won that election and that seat in 2016, becoming the first Dominican in history of the United States to be elected to Congress, and also the first formally undocumented person to be elected to congressional office in the United States. The lessons here again now is that appearances also matter. That Nidia's lessons, her district lessons, we had to apply them to Washington Heights. Otherwise, we could have run the risk of losing a potential 3rd district. It also reaffirms the seat of Black political power in Brooklyn as opposed to Harlem. So some people may look at this episode in 2010 and say, oh, there was a big shift between Dominican power, Latino power, and African-American power. You're not paying attention. That shift happened demographically decades before. That is, the registered number of voters in the Black community of Harlem was diminishing over time in decades, so that this was just a culmination of demographic changes in Manhattan and Bronx County. By the time we get to the 2010s, we were then forecasting, can we win other districts? And that was not easy to do because we just created a 3rd Latino congressional district that eventually elected Espaillat. The only other one was in Queens and in the Bronx. It's the 14th congressional plurality district. That means it wasn't a majority Latino district. And even today, it hovers just below 50%. And those questions are, we're about 16% Asian American, 19% white. The Centro report that we're going to hear about in a minute estimates that Latino population grew in that district by 2% over the last decade. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made history by defeating Joe Crowley in a primary in 2018 to capture the district with a Latino plurality, not a majority, giving her a lot of credit to how she was able to organize her campaign. The Centro now estimates in this report that you're going to hear about today that the total population decreased by about 3% in the New York 14th. And the Centro also reports on 2 additional districts that are actually led by 2 people who identify as Latino. One, Antonio Delgado up in Hudson Valley in Catskills, and the other one, Nicole Maliotakis out of Staten Island. Our lessons and our final lessons for this are pretty clear. We have been there and we've done this before. Whenever we have redistricting in which the delegation of New York State contracts, we have less seats available to us. We have definitely done this before. That is not new to us. We've been able to handle this before, although every time we do this is always a risk. Let's be clear that we have been able to preserve what we have in previous cycles. Contraction defined what happened 10 years ago when 2 parties were in charge. Senate's ruled by Republicans, the Assembly ruled by the Democrats. Now the question is, what will it be now? Because the Democrats control all those 3 positions in that room in Albany, those 3 seats in the room. Will that result in a clearer process and a unanimity in a way that protects the voting strength of Latino voters, African-American voters, and Asian-American voters? Time will tell. Secondly, will the process be amended? We'll talk about that in a minute with Fulvia de Vargas de Leon. She'll be able to talk to you about these things in detail. But redistricting does not guarantee success. That's another lesson that we've learned historically, and we'll learn it over again if we forget our history. 2 weeks before the congressional primaries of next year are not new to us. We've had to rush before. This time we'll rush even faster, because as will be noted later on in this program, you will hear about how the census is delayed its release of the data in a way that gives us a lot of concern, but we can handle this too. So the bottom line here is we should be able to preserve, if we use all of our forces together, what we have and to eventually go beyond. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Juan. You know, a lot of exciting things that were said there. I think that folks should be jotting down their questions. I know it was fast. I actually felt a little anxious throughout because not because it was fast, because I wanted to really dig in to each segment and to each slide. And so Before we jump into questions for Cartagena, and please make sure that you put your questions in the Q&A section and jot them down and send them over to us. We'll make sure to take them after the following presentation. I want to invite back Carlos Vargas Ramos. For those of you that joined us a little later, after Carlos introduced himself, he's the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Director for Public Policy, External and Media Relations and Development. As a social scientist, he has worked on the impact of migration on Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican political behavior, political attitudes and orientations, as well as, I can go on and on, but as well as issues on racial identity. And so thank you very much, Carlos, and please feel free to add anything else I missed.
Good evening, my name is Carlos Vargas Ramos. I will be presenting this evening on a research brief that we have recently released to the public entitled Redistricting 2020 Challenges to Hispanic Congressional Representation in New York State. Every 10 years, the Constitution of the United States calls for the apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives. This reallocation of political power in the US Congress is based on the changes in population nationally every 10 years, and the primary reason for which the decennial census is conducted. The Constitution calls for representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers. New York State currently has 27 representatives in the US House of Representatives. While the 2020 decennial census data is not yet available, we can extrapolate about national and state level trends based on the changes in population from year to year and between 2010 and 2019. Because of the population changes nationally, New York State is likely to lose one representative and possibly two. The present analysis is based on the extrapolation from 2010 and 2019 population data from the US Census Bureau. Between 2010 and 2019, the US population grew by 6%, but New York State grew at a much slower rate than the country as a whole and the vast majority of other states. In contrast to New York, other states around the country, particularly on the South, mountain states, and in the West, they grew at rates sometimes twice the national rate of growth for the population. These states will increase their congressional representation. New York State, on the other hand, will likely lose congressional representation. These changes in congressional representation following this pattern of geographical distribution is something we already saw in previous apportionment processes after the 2010 census. At that time, states in the Northeast, including New York, as well as the Midwest, lost congressional representation because of population losses. On the other hand, states in the Southeast, Southwest, and Northwest increased their congressional representation, all as a result of population gains. New York State has been losing congressional representation since its political power peaked in 1940. Since 1990 alone, the state has lost 2 congressional districts each decade. But because of its very low population growth, we expect New York State to lose 1 and maybe 2 congressional districts in the post-2020 apportion. If New York State is going to lose 1 or 2 congressional districts, where in the state will these districts be lost? What geographic regions of the state will be affected? What population groups within the state may be affected? These are some of the subjects that we will be discussing in tonight's presentation. As of 2019, New York State had an estimated 19.3 million people. But between 2010 and 2019, most of the counties of the state, 49 out of 62, lost population. All of these 49 counties were located upstate or in Eastern Long Island. As figure 1 shows, the geographic distribution of this population change with counties in red, orange, and yellow showed a decrease in population, while the countries in blue, mostly downstate, show that they are increasing in population. Population change in New York State is driven by 2 leading trends: the decrease in the non-Hispanic white population and the increase in the Hispanic as well as the non-Hispanic Asian population. Non-Hispanic whites represented the majority of the state population in 2019, 55%. Hispanics, on the other hand, represented 19%, non-Hispanic Blacks represented 14%, and non-Hispanic Asians represented 9%, almost 9% of the state's population. New York State gained just under 54,000 people between 2010 and 2019. But Hispanics increased by more than 319,000 persons, or a 9% increase. Non-Hispanic Asians increased by more than 259,000 people, or more than 17%. On the other hand, non-Hispanic whites decreased by more than 582,000 people, or 5% of their growth, of their numbers. Non-Hispanic blacks decreased by more than 15,000 people, or 0.5% loss. The growth of the Hispanic and Asian population and the decline of the non-Hispanic white population largely drive the population dynamics in New York State, as I have just reiterated. The non-Hispanic white population declined in 59 of 62 counties throughout the state. In New York City, their decline centered in Queens and the Bronx. Their growth took place in Kings County and in New York County. The non-Hispanic Asian and Latino population each only lost population in one county: Tioga County for Asians, Kings County for Hispanics. At the congressional district level, population change between 2010 and 2019 ranged between a gain of 8% in district number 8, and a loss rather of 4% in the 23rd district in upstate New York. Of the 27 congressional districts in New York, 14 districts saw their population increase, while 12 districts lost population. One district didn't really have any change in population. 5 of the congressional districts that saw population decline were located downstate: 3 in New York City, 2 in Long Island. The remaining 7 districts with declining population were all located upstate: 1 in the Catskill or Hudson Valley region, 1 in the North Country, 2 in the Finger Lakes region, 1 in the Southern Tier, 1 containing Rochester, and 1 containing Buffalo. The non-Hispanic white population decreased in 22 congressional districts, shown in figure 5 in yellow, orange, or red. Notice that the biggest drop in the non-Hispanic white population in congressional districts took place in districts represented by Representatives Meng, the 6th district, or Ocasio-Cortez, the 14th district. The non-Hispanic white population increased in only 5 districts. In districts represented by Congressman Espaillat, the 13th, Congressman Jeffries, the 8th, Congressman Torres, the 15th, Congresswoman Velasquez, the 7th, and Congresswoman Clark, the 9th. The Hispanic population grew in 26 districts across the state, and it decreased in only 1 district, district number 7, represented by Representative Velasquez. Non-Hispanic Asians increased in 26 districts and decreased in 1, also a district represented by Representative Velasquez, number 7. Non-Hispanic blacks increased in 16 districts and declined in 11. In terms of Hispanic vulnerability, which is the core and the substance of this representation, we are concerned that 3 congressional districts statewide that lost population are represented by Hispanics: the 7th, the 14th, and the 19th. 1 district is represented by a representative with long seniority and standing, Representative Velasquez, the 7th district. But 2 districts are not, since they are only represented, or they have been represented rather, by representatives who've been in office for only 1 full term. These are Representative Delgado of the 19th district and Representative Ocasio-Cortez of the 14th district. 2 districts, on the other hand, represented by Hispanics, grew in population, but the concern with these districts is that because they are adjacent to districts that lost population, and because one of these districts that gained population will be represented by a newly elected representative, they may be vulnerable to redistricting. Because of the loss of population and how these districts are adjacent to other districts that have gained population but have newly elected representatives, Hispanic representatives may be vulnerable to have their districts redrawn and consolidated, pitting those representatives with others in adjacent districts who may not enjoy the weight and influence incumbency may provide. Districts with the most population loss, the 23rd, the 22nd, the 21st, represented by non-Hispanic white representatives, are adjacent to each other and to other districts that lost population as well. So we may want to look at these districts as potentially engaged in this consolidation of districts as a result of population loss. A loss of Hispanic congressional representation is highly undesirable. New York would have lost population and even more congressional representation had it not been for the growth of the Hispanic population. Instead, the state of New York increased its population marginally as a result of the large growth of the Hispanic population. Therefore, congressional redistricting in New York should prevent the disenfranchisement of the growing Hispanic population. Congressional redistricting should not come at the expense of Hispanic representation. Neither should it come at the expense of other groups that have struggled for the equal and equitable representation throughout the decade. Safeguarding Hispanic legislative representation in the redistricting process is an important community goal. Hispanic voters repeatedly support and elect Hispanic candidates when given the opportunity to do so. Just as important is the goal of preserving or attaining meaningful influence as constituents and voters, even when no Hispanic candidate runs for elected office. Redistricting bodies, such as the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission, but ultimately the New York State Legislature must strive to create legislative districts of maximum Hispanic political influence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to invite Juan Cartagena back and Carlos. We want to take questions that perhaps have been posed by the audience. I don't see any, but if anyone has questions, I do want to get the party started and see if I can ask a question of either of you. You know, there's data, which we heard from Carlos. There's the historical legalities and historical representation that we heard from Cartagena. And I'm curious about the weight of the politics that come in here, right? And that's probably a conversation that we can entertain a little bit more, but, you know, just paying attention to 27 seats and the current demographics that we have, right? 27, that means that we have about 720,000 people per congressional district, right? We're just taking those population estimates, right? Nothing scientific here, I'm just dividing. We assume that if we go down to 25 congressional seats, the potential of losing 2, we have approximately 778,000. That's a much larger seat, which decreases, it pretty much decreases the number, I would say, you know, it absolutely makes it so that these districts are much larger and we have less representation for the people of New York, right, by 2. What impact is this going to have, you know, politically? We've been through a different decade, very different decade. This is very different. I mean, we did see Obama get elected in 2008, and I'm sure that weighed in on the politics, but just curious as to what your thoughts are on the weight of the politics into this process versus just purely data. And because we now lost, and we'll hear a little bit more from Fulvia, right, on Section 5 and what that means to us, just curious about how much weight we're going to be placing more on the politics versus on the data and the legal dynamics.
Let me take a stab and then Carlos can give us some more detail on this. But by definition, it basically means that New York's political power in Congress is waning. And I think Carlos can probably back me up, but that's nothing new. We've been losing representation for some time. So the power and the ability to get things done in the House of Representatives will be diminished accordingly. Because what we're not saying here, but was clear, I think, from Carlos's presentation, is that when New York loses 2, where do they go? Well, I understand that Texas may gain 4 additional seats. I understand Florida will gain either 1 or 2 additional seats. So those delegations are now have more power to decide a lot of things, including who becomes the speaker in case there's a shift in the political dynamics of either the House, of the House. So that's what it comes down to. The fact that New York State has the Senate leader, it comes from New York State, Senator Schumer, is one thing, but the House is always in play. And the midterm elections coming up after this redistricting round will be critically important.
And as to your question, Lucia, thank you. Definitely the fact that it is likely that not just representatives in New York State, but nationwide, but in particular New York State, because of the significant population that we have and the reduced number of seats, even though the Constitution calls for equal representation, there can only be so much variation within a state. There may be some variations between states, right? So, you know, we see definitely states that only have one representative. Vermont, Wyoming, Montana, they may only represent 680,000, 690,000 people, whereas somebody representing a district in New York State is going to be representing over 770,000 people. And that is still constitutional. That is still speaks to the wide discrepancy in representation in the United States. And you know, that is not necessarily something that we can resolve within the institutional setup that we have presently. But insofar as what would happen to members of Congress, members of the House of Representatives in New York State, they will definitely have to perhaps travel longer. They will have to become versed in more diverse communities. So they will have to develop a cultural competency that is needed to handle multiple constituencies. So now, you know, as you know, Juan mentioned, we try to perhaps create districts or create opportunities for candidates from districts that are the majority of that district. But as the population becomes fewer, you know, we have fewer population, and as the population in those districts becomes more varied, it becomes more of a challenge for any elected official to represent in constituents within those districts.
I'm sure that's going to raise a couple of questions in and of itself. You know, we have one question from Raquel Batista. Hello, Raquel. Will redistricting in New York take into account populations that have left because of the pandemic? Did many Latinos leave New York? And how will this issue be dealt with?
Yeah, very good question. Unfortunately, the answer is that the census, the decennial census, will dictate everything having to do with redistricting. So that means the census was taken with respect to who lived in New York State as of April 1st of last year. All that information has already been taken. If it did not account for people who left, it's too late to change it now. And remember that what Carlos Vargas Ramos is showing us are estimates based on the data we have available now. All of that will be adjusted because the official data that comes out from the decennial census. So Raquel, also, hello, ¿qué tal? Good to see you, good to hear from you. The fact of the matter is that whatever shifts happen because of the pandemic, if they're not captured at the time the decennial census was taken last year, they're not going to be adjusted.
And that's a great point, Juan, because there was a Supreme Court case that established that we must rely on the decennial census and they cannot be adjusted statistically. And that is why what happened politically last year with the census, the fact that there were attempts at the highest echelons of the federal government to make it more difficult for people to respond to the census, will have consequences now. It's not just about getting the data.
So we have 3 questions and I want to make sure we get through them. So I'm going to say 2 first and then we'll leave the second one in case we can get around to it and maybe I'll answer it in the next panel. But one is from Khalil Vasquez. What was the basis of Latinos not being an interest group and what is the status of now legally? Cartagena, that would be Nydia Velasquez, right? And just to add to that, you know, I want to add, have there been any cases since that have created this community of interest argument where Latinos have shown commonality before the courts and viewed that way?
Very quickly, the arguments that Latinos are a community of interest that need protection and recognition in the redistricting process have been made post that case. They have been made in the political arena, they've been made in the court of public opinion, and they have been successful. There's no question that Latinos are a community of interest on many, many levels, across many, many nationalities and across many, many geographies. The reason why that became an issue in that case is because you had a concerted effort by some members of the Latinx community to put wedges between our alleged commonality, all with respect to trying to make that district different than what it was. And The narrow answer is they succeeded because the district had to be redrawn. But the larger question is, if they thought that by redrawing the district, it would not produce a Latina to be elected from that district, then they were wrong because Nydia was able to win regardless.
Great. The next question is, what percentage of adult Latinos in the state are eligible to vote? And how does that compare to other ethnicities?
I don't have the data accessible to me right now, but considering that like Hispanics represent about 19% of the population, it is about 14, give or take, of the citizen voting age population. That doesn't mean that those are the ones that are registered to vote. To be eligible to vote, you have to be registered. To be registered to vote, you have to be a U.S. citizen and 18 years of age and older.
And Cartagena, can you just elaborate on that question around voters, just so folks are clear about who gets counted in the districts?
Right. Right now, the law stands that all persons, regardless of immigration status, regardless of age, all persons are counted for the purposes of creating these numbers in the decennial census that will be the bedrock for all congressional redistricting and redistricting beyond Congress, state Senate, state and state assembly. So the good news is everybody's supposed to be counted. We all know, if you've been reading what happened in the last year and a half, the Trump administration tried to change that. Those changes were stopped in the courts. So all persons are still going to be counted for that purpose.
And I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more detail when I introduce Fulvia after this question and answer period. But the reality is that not only do you have total populations of those big figures that I talked about, of which every congressional rep represents everyone in their district, right? And it's those numbers that we use to reapportion the congressional seats. But then when you get into the ability to elect, then we start looking at voting age population of that larger number of the total pop. And then you get into citizen voting age population to either push or justify or create a district that has the ability for the majority of its population to be able to elect. And so we're going to see that being dissected, data being dissected, right, throughout. The next question is from Cesar Ruiz. Is there a sense of which existing districts, here we go, the politics, could be affected by the loss of a seat or two? Are there particular Latino districts that will be vulnerable? Damn, I want to answer that, but go ahead, guys.
Dale, Carlos, dale.
Well, that was the basis of my paper. The fact that, we fear that perhaps districts that have lost the most population, Nidia Velázquez's, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Delgado's, they're vulnerable. It doesn't mean that they have to be lost. Doesn't mean that we have to lose these Hispanic representatives, but they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable because, we know the political conditions that Representative Ocasio-Cortez is under. She's representing a challenge to the existing leadership within the Democratic Party, right? So, she might be vulnerable along those lines. Representative Velázquez, on the other hand, she's solidly situated within the leadership of the Democratic Party, and she has long seniority and standing. We also have Congressman Ricky Torres, who is newly elected, adjacent to Ocasio-Cortez's district, and those two districts might be combined to form one. So those are the dangers, but that's why I want to point out to the fact that upstate is where you have lost most population. So if there is going to be any loss of districts, let's look at upstate New York and Eastern Long Island.
Listen, Great. That is so, Lucia, I'm sorry, I got to jump in here.
Oh, great.
The biggest takeaway for me on this report is there is no way, read my lips, there is no way we can allow Albany to reduce our congressional delegation in our communities, because we have been the engine of growth in New York State and in New York City. If you want to take away 2 seats, búscalo allá arriba. Go upstate and find them, not downstate.
That's right. And there's so many ways of slicing a pie, there's not only one way. And so we know that there's absolutely different ways of being able to say there's a Latino district and staying with those. And now that we don't have Section 5, I'm assuming retrogression is no longer a topic of conversation. So no elected, whether you've been elected moons ago or most recently, have the same kind of protections that they would have had when Section 5 was in existence. So I want to thank folks. I want to kind of answer the last question about Latino justice activities. If Cartagena, you can respond that in the chat, in the type the answer out. And I wanna thank you both, and I wanna open it up. I wanna introduce Fulvia Vargas from Latino Justice. She's the Associate Counsel at LatinoJustice-PRLDEF. Her practice focuses on voting rights issues, including enfranchisement of individuals formerly incarcerated and language access, as well as redistricting. Really excited to know that now we have another fellow female working on redistricting. So please, Fulvia.
My name is Fulvia Vargas de Leon, and I am an Associate Counsel with Latino Justice. My portion of today's webinar will cover the redistricting process in New York. All right, so as we begin speaking on redistricting and reapportionment, I want to highlight two words that you may hear throughout this presentation or throughout the redistricting process in New York. The first is reapportionment, and what reapportionment means is the determination of how the 435 seats in Congress will be allocated. What we will be speaking about today is redistricting, which is a redrawing of congressional and legislative districts in New York. As is noted on this slide, according to the last census report, reapportionment data will be released on April 30th, 2021. That is tentative. The redistricting data is set for September 30th, 2021. So just to add some humor of sorts to this presentation, here is a political cartoon I found. It's two puzzle pieces. It says gerrymandered district. On the left, the piece says, we're your elected officials. And on the right, it says, exactly, we elected you to be our voters. So just as we navigate redistricting, I do want you to consider that redistricting will impact not only who gets to vote within the district, but how the power of that vote and who is ultimately elected to represent those voters. Okay, so New York redistricting in 2021. Some of us here today are experts in what I call redistricting. They have done many, many redistricting cycles. But one thing we all share right now is that all of us are new to this redistricting process in New York. None of us have ever experienced a redistricting process that is managed by what is now called the Independent Redistricting Commission, which I will speak about in the next slide. So in 2014, there was a constitutional amendment that established the Independent Redistricting Commission. You will see me refer to this commission as the IRC throughout the presentation. So what exactly is the Independent Redistricting Commission? So prior to the creation of the Independent Redistricting Commission, so prior to 2014 in the last redistricting cycle, which took place in 2011, redistricting was conducted solely by the state legislature through the New York State Legislative Task Force on Demographic Research and Reapportionment, also known as LATFR to most people. So that it was the commission or the group that redistricted in New York as part of the legislature. It was all done by the legislature. There was no independent commission. Now in 2014, this amendment was created that established the Independent Redistricting Commission. That commission is a 10-member commission, which draws boundaries for both congressional and state legislative redistricting. The state and assembly majority and minority leaders each appoint 2 members to the commission for a total of 8 appointed commissioners. And then those 8 appointed commissioners must then select by majority the final new commissioner. As part of the 2014 amendment, there were set redistricting requirements that were set by the New York State Constitution. The commission was required, when the redistricting process would begin, the Redistricting Commission was required to make sure that any maps that were created followed these principles. The first, contiguity, which means that each state shall consist of contiguous territory, meaning you can travel from any point in the district to any other point within such district without crossing the district boundary. Basically, in the most simple terms, what that meant was that if I was within my voting district and I crossed the street and then I turned the corner, I am not stepping back and forth into other voting districts. Compactness, each district shall be as compact in form as practicable. Competition, Districts cannot be drawn to discourage competition or for the purpose of favoring or disfavoring a particular candidate or political party. And the commission must also consider maintaining existing districts. Political boundaries, the redistricting plan must heed county and municipal boundaries and preserve the integrity of county and city lines as much as is possible. The commission shall consider the maintenance of core of existing districts of pre-existing political subdivisions, including counties, cities, and towns, and communities of interest. Now, I want to stop here and really highlight this point in light of Carlos's presentation on what this redistricting cycle would mean for the Hispanic community in light of the increase in the Hispanic population in New York City. So when we talk about political boundaries and competition, we're talking about the commission being required to keep these, to draw districts and maintain what I would call the status quo as much as possible. But what does this mean for redistricting today when it comes to addressing the growth of Latinos in New York? Any map, just for clarification, any map that is drawn must still comply with Section 2 requirements, as was discussed by my colleague Juan. Maintaining existing district in light of an increase in Hispanic population may lead to voter dilution or Section 2 violations, depending on how that population is distributed among the districts. Also, we must consider, as Carlos mentioned, where will the loss of seats occur in New York? The idea of maintaining existing districts as much as possible must be discussed in the context of whether any changes will dilute voting power of Hispanic districts, which are already established in New York. The idea is not to just have a seat at the table for the Hispanic community and the voting power that they currently hold, but they should also be able to have an impact in the electoral changes within the voting districts where there are a majority population. So the current plan for redistricting through the Independent Redistricting Commission, or the IRC, is after engaging in public hearings, and there is a lot of details about where those hearings will be held in the Constitution, and following the criteria that was set forth in the previous slides, the IRC must draw and approve a map with at least 7 votes, including 1 commissioner appointed by each legislative leader. If the legislature is under divided party control, which it is not at this point, the 7 votes must include at least 1 appointee by the Speaker and 1 by the Senate temporary president. If no map reaches the threshold, commission will forward the map with the most commission support to the state legislature. So based on the current timeline in the Constitution, the IRC would submit the first proposed map to the legislature by January 1st, with some leeway to propose a map as late as January 15th of 2022. This legislature at that point can approve the maps without amendment or reject the plan. When the state, just as a note, when the state and assembly are controlled by the same party, as is the case now, votes to approve a map must get 2/3 support in each chamber. If split party control, approval requires a simple majority. So let's say the plan is submitted, the legislature decides to reject the map. The IRC then has a second opportunity to submit a map no later than February 28th of 2022. If that map is rejected or vetoed, the process then moves out of the IRC, and the legislature now is tasked with drawing its own maps, however it decides to do so, or make amendments to plans if they see it's fitting. And do know that throughout this process, the governor's vetoes at that point can be overridden if he or she vetoed any previous maps. Now, as I said before, those were the amendments and the timeline that was set forth when the amendment passed in 2014. However, recently, as recent of January, there was a proposed change to that amendment that will be on the November 2021 ballot. Now, these changes were made or according to the legislature, are in place to move the timeline of when redistricting plans would be submitted and approved to conform to when our primaries are held. In 2014, we did not have primaries held in June, and so because of that change, this new amendment was created to kind of align with that timeline. Now, of course, we're all assuming that we are going to receive the data from the census by September 30th, and we're hopeful maybe that it's even sooner so that the Redistricting Commission can get to work. But working with that premise, this 2021 amendment, which will be voted on in November, requires that the first plan be submitted no later than January 1st. So there's no longer that January 15th deadline. The second plan must be submitted by January 15th. If the second plan is rejected by the legislature or vetoed by the governor, the legislature can amend the second plan as it deems necessary. So there's no longer that February 28th deadline. It just moves up the process significantly. Calls for maps to be approved without the support of 7 or more commissioners, regardless of partisan control of the legislature. So it no longer requires it to be, depending on how the votes are split within the commission, it just requires 7 votes for approval out of the 10 members. Regardless of legislature party control, a simple majority is sufficient for map approval in the Senate and Assembly. So this does away with the 2/3 requirement that was initially in place by the 2014 amendment. That portion of the amendment was put in place to ensure that regardless of party control, minority party would have a say, at least a decisive say, in the maps that are selected. So it would do away with that 2/3 requirement. If legislature is responsible for map drawing, a 60% majority is sufficient for approval, regardless of partisan control. Additional changes proposed in the amendment also include capping the state centers at 63 state members and prison gerrymandering. So including for redistricting purposes that persons incarcerated would be counting at their last place of residence. These are some of the legal challenges and consideration that we can speak on in the 2021 redistricting. I will not go too much into it, but something for you to think about if you're curious about case law that pertains to redistricting in this upcoming cycle. So lastly, I want to speak on the goals for the Hispanic community in 2021 redistricting. Given the growth in population, we want to advocate against maps which push forward vote dilution among the community, or what we call maps, which have the power to minimize or cancel out the voting strength of the community. We have to think about, is there an opportunity today to create for an additional majority Hispanic voting district? We also have to ensure that given the loss of population that was highlighted by across the state, drawing of maps is not at the expense of a largely Hispanic voting district. We do not want to do away with the progress that we've already made. We also want to that we are engaging the community and understanding the importance of redistricting, why it matters, what does it affect, and what does it mean for the next 10 years.
You know, Fulvia, I want to open it up for some questions. Sorry, Robert, Assemblyman Rodriguez. Before we go there, are there any, I want to make sure folks have a chance to place questions in the chat, but you know, you did talk about changes to the way in which New York State is going to redraw. There's definitely some new political considerations. It's the first time that the state of New York is going to be led by Democrats during a redistricting process. Yeah, first time in a couple, at least since a couple of decades.
At least since we've been around.
Yeah, since I was born, way before that. Let me just highlight that. What do you see to be, I mean, there's a ballot question still, right? So voters are going to see and have an opportunity to vote still. They did this in 2014. They'll vote again now for those changes, right? What do you see as some additional challenges that could come as a result of the changes in the way in which districts are redrawn?
Do you want me to speak more on the ballot initiatives first or just the changes overall?
As you please.
Okay, so the ballot initiatives are a bit of concern because I think when we talk about voters going out mid-year elections, you know, we know that ballot initiatives are not necessarily read sometimes and they're just checked off, and there's huge changes that are proposed compared to the 2014 amendment. So that is a concern. Will voters understand exactly what that means? I think if we take a step back, however, what is most concerning is that many people don't even know that I think are aware of the change that was made to our redistricting, right? I think if you ask anybody about the 2014 amendment and what the creation of the IRC, they probably look at you like a deer in headlights.
If you ask anybody about redistricting, they'll look at you the same way.
And I think that is a concern, right? We can talk about, the delays in the census. We can talk about how the IRC will be able to complete their duties this year. We can speak about that all day. But when we take a step back, we really need to focus on making sure that people are aware of what redistricting means and really what it means for the next 10 years, because now that we have a change, I guess, in political parties, what that exactly will mean as well.
Great. One of the questions that I know folks had is, what can, and I know they asked how to get involved more with Latino justice. There are going to be activities of the commission. What are some of the ways that Latinos can get involved in the process early on and through the process?
I think, first of all, for those of us who are in the work of redistricting, it's our duty, I think, to educate the community about why redistricting is important. Because we put so much emphasis on the census and so much emphasis on getting people out and make sure you complete the census, and we knock on doors and we go from street to street making sure people complete it, but then we don't mention what happens with it, right? And I think that's our first step. The second, I would say, is really to get people aware of the public hearings that are going to take place. Make people aware of the fact that think about your community, think about what's important to you, think about your representative now. Maybe you don't know your representative. Maybe you're in a district where you're just trying to figure out how you're part of that district, and the block over is not, depending on how your district was drawn. So really emphasize, I think, bring home the point of how redistricting makes a difference and trying to get people involved in the process. Yes, map drawing may not be the most exciting thing to most, maybe to you, Lucia, and I think for most of us on this call, but really, the public does have an opportunity to engage in map drawing if they so choose to, and participate and show maps and show that they're a community of interest potentially, and show that they do want to have a voice in the process. And I think really participating in it will hopefully make a difference, at least now that we have the IRC.
So we heard of, Cartagena gave us background, Carlos provided us, anticipated data and data growth. You're giving us the process, the rules of engagement, essentially, and some of the goals that we should be looking at in terms of ensuring, because at the end of the day, it's ensuring that the voter has power to elect whomever they choose.
Whoever, yeah.
And that the community as a whole, as a collective, has that collective power, because we know that collectively there are fundamental issues that are still at the heart of our communities that need to be addressed, that should be addressed, that should be seen as, right, as collective power. Is there, if the data does not reflect, we grab the data in the middle of a pandemic. I remember, folks not wanting to knock on doors. Who's going to knock on doors, right?
Someone knocked on my door and I was like, what are you doing?
And the question here is, can New York State, we've seen multiple challenges, to the previous administrations trying to, get over and put certain restrictions on who gets counted. But can New York City or New York State challenge the decennial results if, in fact, they don't reflect the population that we know lives and thrives in New York City or in New York State?
Actually, I'm not sure if they can challenge the results entirely unless they have some basis for which they would say that the count was not done properly or somehow excluded certain groups of populations. I think they would have some sort of basis for challenging, not just outright saying, I don't agree with these results.
Yeah. And we know that in the past there have been, I know people were keeping notes and folks were jotting down where activity was happening, where it was not happening, right? Essentially to whether or not that can happen. Folks ask that question, but I think one of the things we should pay attention to is the timeline, right? The timeline from when we received the data is very different now. Places like New Jersey had to change their entire schematic because they were supposed to have districts in place by June. They changed their constitution. But New York State is going to see slight of a challenge with the data. Maybe they have about 6 months less time than they used to, or maybe like 4 months less time than they used to. So those are all things that let's do this. I want to reserve additional time for questions once we have additional presentations. So Fulvia, thank you. I want to and invite our next panelist, our Assembly member, Robert Rodriguez, who currently serves on Lap 4. And thank you so much for joining us, Assembly Member. I remember when we started redistricting, you were not an Assembly Member decades ago. So please, thank you.
Thank you, yeah, Lucia. I missed the intro, but I'm going to pick it up right where you left off. And I just want to say thank you to Fulvia for that really important cover of what the Independent Redistricting Commission is and what we're trying to accomplish here. And I think one of the things that the takeaway is, because of the push by many good government groups to have a diverse redistricting process, that essentially the legislature has chosen to outsource, in a sense, much of the work that goes into the redistricting process, and that's was pushed forward in a constitutional amendment, and also redistricting process. So I think that's an important part of what we're talking about, is that the legislature wanted to create and the voters wanted to create a more fair process, a more open process, a more transparent process for the redistricting process to move ahead. So I think that's an important point in the conversation, and that's why we have this new Independent Redistricting Commission. Now, I chair the Legislative Advisory Task Force on reapportionment and demographic research, and that was the old way of doing things. The old way still exists, but it really exists only as a fail-safe, in the event that that the Independent Redistricting Commission is not able to present a plan on 2 occasions. Again, it was mentioned that there are 2 opportunities for the commission to put forward data and a plan to the legislature to approve. And I think that's a critically important point in terms of just trying to make sure that they have every opportunity to do that, and there's still guardrails in terms of us being able to accept that those things that we care about as a legislature, that those things in terms of maintaining demographic and community consistency, maintaining the lines within counties and municipalities, and also frankly to make sure that opportunities for minority groups who have grown and are now, moving beyond to creating a strong sense are not carved out of the process, as we have seen in a number of different instances, and arguably, some of our Senate seats have strategically done that as a way to, disaggregate white communities and to disenfranchise people. So much of the efforts that we have are in support of making sure that the Independent Redistricting Commission, that the voters have voted to support, are in fact given the opportunity to be successful. However, what we do know is that in this particular year, with the census and with COVID, that the numbers are delayed, and there's no advantage to anybody or any system with the numbers being delayed. It just means that we have to all operate collectively in a much shorter time frame. And I think that's the critical path. I think by April 30th, we may have some information about what the congressional districts may look like, but it won't be until September 30th that we really know what the specific community related population data looks like. And I think that's going to be, what drives all of the momentum moving forward. But when we talk about this process about the Independent Redistricting Commission, is that it really creates a framework for a minimum of 12 meetings across the state that allows for real public engagement to talk about where are the like communities, where are those places that have either historically been disenfranchised or lost their voice, and how do we make sure that we create opportunistically, places for significant representation, and I think that's where we're going, and I think the challenge, and as was commented a little bit more about this, the amendments to the constitutional process, is that we have even less time. I think the request to try and put this ballot initiative in November is because with elections happening in June and being required so that we are able to get appropriate votes in from overseas to be part of the electoral process and not being able to have later primaries, we have to be able to allow for the electoral counties and bodies to be able to adjust to be able to prepare for the elections based on the new redistricted areas. So I think, as we pushed into the older February 28th timeframe, that gives even less time for the County Board of Elections, to be prepared with the new redistricting lines, and particularly with the protections and expansions of methods and means that we have moved in the legislature and adopted to allow people to vote, early voting, and new technology for being able to print multiple ballots, ranked choice voting, in certain elections. I mean, all these different things, put more pressure on county and local boards to be able to get things up, running, and available for June primary. So I think that's certainly some of the thinking behind the timing around that independent, the revisions to the constitutional amendment, and then also making sure that we're able to get significant data from the IRC. And I think we believe that they're going to be able to put something out that's meaningful, that takes into consideration all the community input, and respects the participation of the public throughout this process, and provide that to the legislature. And we want to make sure that that doesn't get held back, in abeyance, by folks who, may not agree with where the commission is going, and that, and that at the specified dates, that, if and even if they're not able to provide a plan, that they're still able to provide us with whatever the general consensus is, whatever the specific data is on those issues, that we're able to have something to work with, that incorporates the robust process that should be in place, from, as soon as we're able to get that process going. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context as to how we got here, of what the role of the LAT4 body is, the work that we've done in terms of making sure that prisoners are counted in the specific areas that they resided back home, not where they're currently residing if they're incarcerated. That's critical work that is a responsibility of LAT4, and that will find its will be solidified in this revised constitutional amendment. I think that has been stated in the past, however, not included in the constitutional amendment. So in this case, we're even more explicit about that being a requirement of this process. So with that, I'll take a pause, and then we'll let Lucia be welcome to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Assembly Member. I think that, you mentioned something right now towards the tail end that I think we want to make sure that, we have clarity on, which is, prisoners being counted at home, right, versus in the location of their prisons. And so, there is potentially a constitutional change to document, to place that in actual constitution, but that won't necessarily impact congressional seats. Is that correct?
Correct. I think it should be included in the population data that we have for the state seats, but we'll have to see how that plays out in terms of providing it to the Independent Redistricting Commission for considering that for the congressional seats.
Right, and why is that even important? Why is it important for prisoners to be counted back home in their neighborhoods, in East Harlem, in the district that you represent, versus upstate in a district, the 149th district? Why is that important?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is those, that takes away much needed population from our communities, folks that are represented, and moves them to places upstate where they are not permanently residing. There's no expectation that they're permanently residing there. The resources, the housing support, the educational support, the support that comes into the communities is not being utilized upstate, it will be utilized in the community where they came from and the community that they return to. So those decisions about funding, you know, should be reflected in those communities and not, you know, in the prison system, you know, in supporting the prison system where they may be temporarily located. So I think that's important because that representation lasts certainly, you know, beyond 10 years, you know, and making sure that that they're counted appropriately. As we're talking about just some of the margins of difference, you know, it could be 3% in one area of a change, you know, versus, you know, a larger or a smaller change downstate. As you can see, you know, they're desperate, you know, in terms of maintaining population in places that are losing significantly upstate, you know, and downstate where they should be accurately counted, you know, a difference of a few percentage points can mean the difference between a, you know, majority Latino district or a majority, you know, African American and Latino district and one that's not, right? So I think, you know, that's why it's, you know, in the areas where the services that they would receive, where the resources need to go, but also that's a reflection of political strength of that community being diluted for purposes of supporting demographic, declining demographics in other places.
Right, and I shut off my video just to make sure your bandwidth wasn't going. But
thank you. I'm sorry we're having problems here.
No worries. I want to make sure that I encourage folks to add their questions onto the questions and answer portion of the webinar, just to make sure that I'm able to capture it. I don't see hands. I just know that they're being raised. But please place your question in the question and answers portion. There's one question: how can the Latino community, you know, as a Latino elected and you being, you know, in the governing legislative body, you know, how can the community help Latino electeds maximize their internal advocacy to preserve Latino seats, to increase Latino participation, electoral participation? What role can the community play?
I think so much of it is, one, engaging folks, and then two, you know, we have to really work hard to demystify many of these processes. I mean, you know, when we were in the campaign for census, how much work had to go into just reminding people what it's for, what it's about, why they need to do it, that they can do it online, overcoming technological barriers, but also why it's important, right? And I mean, and we know that when we have those conversations, you know, those are the things that have to go viral. You know, not half of the things that go viral are not nearly as important as the things that determine our representation, our ability to vote, our ability to get resources, our ability to get government to focus, and those are the things that should. So when we have these conversations that sometimes are hard to follow about redistricting, census, ranked choice voting, you know, these are the things that will determine, you know, who represents us, who goes out there to Albany and says and talks about how $200 billion should be spent in what areas, or $90 billion if you're the city of New York. I mean, you know, those are the people that you're deciding to work for you, and these are the sometimes arcane details that go into making sure that your community is represented, and if not for now, that it gets that it's for later, for that next generation, because the decisions that get made here, as you see, last 10 years. So, you know, your involvement now, you're paying it forward for the next 10 years until the next time we do this process. And we see that, you know, we have been able to make those changes, and as a result, have really significant voices in our country on issues of dramatic importance, be it DREAM Act, be it infrastructure, be it New York City public housing. You know, we need folks who are going to be out there who do that, but that only comes when we're able to concentrate some of our power, some of our voices, and some of our strength, you know, in electoral districts that reflect us.
Great. Thank you so much, Assembly Member. And again, I want to encourage folks to put questions on the webinar's question and answer prompt. But, you know, I just want to highlight something you said, and then we'll move to our next presenter and hopefully gather many more questions. But, you know, you highlighted 12 meetings of the Independent Redistricting Commission, right? In the past, LAC4 used to hold those meetings, but that's an opportunity where the communities, especially when there's a hearing coming you know, your way in your neighborhood, participate. You can attend those, you can listen, you can prep ahead of time, you can talk about the importance of keeping your neighborhoods together, solidarity, unity, whatever the case is, especially because people are already gonna start drawing their maps. They're gonna start, you know, creating their ideal scenarios, picking and choosing their voters. You also talked about timeliness, right? How timely, what the timeliness of how strict of a timeline we had. You talked about September 30 by congressional deadline. Yeah, right. I've never seen that. I'm dying to see that. Let's see if that's even feasible. But lo and behold, we're gonna have a whole new way to draw the Senate, draw the Assembly, and then if we have to eliminate 2 seats, we have to eliminate, we have to redraw Congress in the way we've done it in the past. And so thank you. And let's go on to our next presenter. Ibelis Cuevas Molina. She's an assistant professor of political science at Fordham University. Hi, Ibelis.
Hi.
She currently serves as a nonpartisan member of the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission. Ibelis, does that mean you don't have an affiliation, a party affiliation?
No affiliation.
Are you unaffiliated?
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so thank you. Join us.
Okay. So well, hi everyone, good evening. So as Fulvia explained, the New York State Independent Redistricting Commission was created by a constitutional amendment with the goal of making the redistricting process less partisan, right? Because in the past, it was members of the state legislature who were in charge of the line drawing process. The commission is made up of 10 members. 4 are appointed by the legislative majority, which are Democrats, and 4 are appointed by the legislative minority, which are Republicans. And then those 8 who were initially appointed at the beginning of last year had the responsibility of appointing 2 additional commissioners who were registered voters, but not registered as members of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And that's me. I am one of those members of the commission who is not part of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. So one of the requirements in the Constitution in the work of the commissioners is that commissioners have to reflect the diversity of the residents of the state of New York in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, language, and geographic residence. And that's kind of where I come in as a member of the commissioner. My role in the commission is to, first of all, embody representation of the Hispanic population in the state of New York. And I do so just by virtue of being originally from Puerto Rico and the fact that Spanish is my native language. But second, and most importantly, I see myself as an advocate for Hispanic Democratic representation at the state and congressional levels. And my job as a commissioner is to ensure that Hispanic voters and Hispanics in the state do not see their voting power diluted through the process of redistricting, right? And all of the previous panelists have explained, you know, how voter dilution happens and how Hispanic communities who are consolidated geographically become districts not only at the congressional level, but also at the state level, particularly for the state assembly and the state senate. We also saw that they mentioned that the commission is required by law to hold 12 public hearings across the state. And the Constitution is very specific about the locations where these public hearings are going to be held. These places include Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, White Plains, each of the 5 boroughs of the city of New York, and each of the counties of Long Island. these are required public hearings by the Constitution, right? And we are required to conduct these public hearings after we have published draft lines for the state of New York. And however, it is my intent and my hope that we are going to have public engagement with New Yorkers as soon as the commission is fully funded. It is my hope that we have a series of public hearings before the deadline that we have for September 15th to have our first draft lines, so that we can hear from the public what's wrong with their district lines or what's right with their district lines. What do they want to protect? What are their communities of interest? How do they want their communities to be kept together? So I think that having that public input at the front end of the process before even putting together draft lines is going to be really important. And I hope that we are able to engage in a first series of public hearings before the constitutionally required ones that are meant to happen after September 15th. And in the last hour, I heard from one of the co-executive directors of the commission saying that the Census Bureau is preparing to release interim data in August that may be used in redistricting. So if the timing of the release of that data that they're putting out there actually happens and it works out, we could possibly be in compliance to put out these draft lines by September 15th and have these constitutionally required public hearings happening right after that. But it is my hope to have public hearings before. Another thing that I want to say is that the commission meets in public meetings that are streamed on Zoom through the state Senate, and our next meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Okay, thank you so much, Ivelisse. I did get that notification from the commission notifying us of the upcoming hearing. Do you want to give us a little bit of a highlight of what's going to happen there, or?
Well, I would say that we're definitely going to be discussing the funding for the commission. We will possibly be introducing a new commissioner. I don't know if you guys have seen, but this week we lost Commissioner Keith Wofford, who resigned from the commission, and he has, I think there's someone who has been appointed, so we might be meeting a new commissioner on the Republican side. And then what else are we discussing? Hopefully we will be discussing moving forward with a public engagement plan. Once, it is my hope that we start planning for the day that we are fully funded and able to fully engage with the public.
Wonderful. Do you know if the Independent Redistricting Commission is going to have, aside from the I feel like the horse and pony show that happens during the hearing process, will the commission do anything educationally aside from taking in information? Will you be giving out information? Will that be that component?
So the thing is that we have not been able to discuss having also an education plan because of the fact that we don't have funding. Yeah, so I would assume that as part of our public engagement plan, we are also going to be educating the public as to why redistricting is important, why they should care about it, and how they can engage in the process, how they can give the Redistricting Commission input, right? So it is our expectation that we are going to be able not only to receive input at the public hearings that we plan on doing, but also from members of the public, citizens of New York, just sending us materials, sending us a map of their community of interest. So we're looking at a lot of different alternatives with, particularly our co-executive directors are kind of working behind the scenes with, figuring out all of the infrastructure that we are going to need to receive public input and make sure that the public input that we receive is not only through the public hearings, but also through us just, receiving emails or, and just have a website where people can just, submit their proposals of what are the communities that they want to see protected and kept together.
Great, thank you. Assembly member, do you want to add anything in regards to the funding component? Budget season, go ahead.
Just to update folks on the funding, it is our budget season and final funding has to be determined by April 1st, but recognizing the challenges, even though we did $1 million last year in terms of the budget, getting it out and the mechanism that's been used in terms of using the Department of State has not been working at all. So it is our intention to put in $7 million in this budget. Right now, that's in the one House budget for both the Assembly and the Senate, and we believe that should allow us the resources to do, not just the work of the IRC and data, but also to take on initiatives, in terms of a potential education campaign and significant outreach. So that's why it all matters. It's important for us to raise awareness on that because we have 2 weeks to make sure that that $7 million does in fact get appropriated and that people who are and who care about redistricting and making sure voices are heard support this initiative so it doesn't get lost in the weeds during the process.
Assembly member, I'm going to turn it back to Ivelisse because, I'm actually very curious after you heard Carlos' presentation, and Assembly member, you can respond to if you want after Ivelisse, but after you heard Carlos's presentation about the demographic shifts and the reality that our communities have not lost population, the stance that any kind of decrease in congressional representation should not and cannot come from neighborhoods where Latino communities would be negatively impacted because we've been fueling the demographics. And then you also heard from Fulvia providing some priorities and some goals for the Latino community. Your role in the Independent Redistricting Commission is to ensure that the commission does its work, is able to do so, through, in this case, a nonpartisan lens. Curious about your challenges and how you see both, your experience in the realm, but at the same time, understanding the process. And two, what are your thoughts about the Latino community's population, how you use that to draw and get insight into political power and how that's being shaped by the data itself, so.
Right, so in the redistricting process, there's a lot of rules, right, as to what data we can and cannot use in the redistricting process. But thankfully, race and ethnicity and language communities are one of those key components that we should and will use in the redistricting process, right? And in my view, as someone who, teaches Latino politics, who teaches race and politics, and who believes in protecting the voting rights and voting power of minority voters, I think that it's my role to make sure that there is no voter dilution of the Hispanic community across the state, right? Either if it is here in New York City where I live or in other areas of the state, right? And I know that it's going to be a challenging process, right? Because you know, I think that it's clear that the commission is ideologically split kind of 50-50. So, you know, it'll, you know, I think that it's going to be a very challenging process, but I think that my fellow commissioners are, you know, people who believe in democracy in the same way that I do, right? I think that that is the one unifying thing that we all have in common. And, you know, it's been really great working with all of these people and getting to know them. And I think that there is great possibilities for the work that we are going to be doing, and that this work that we will do will, you know, be work that will be acceptable to the legislature. So it is my hope that we come up with lines that do not get challenged, right? That do protect voting rights for all, and that, you know, we get through this process as smoothly as possible, and that as part of that there is a protection of Hispanics and Hispanic voters.
Great, thank you. Assemblymember, I have you on video. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to respond?
Okay, well, I just wanted to certainly respond and say thank you to the commissioner for her service, because we did not give her the, you know, she did not volunteer for the easiest role. She is the sole Latino, you know, Latinx person on this body. And, you know, it of course makes us extraordinarily proud.
Which did not come easy.
Nothing comes easy in this game, Lucia, you know that. But, you know, but we are very proud of the role that she's playing there. And, you know, we all wear, you know, I'm glad that she wears it. I wear it as well. We wear our Latinidad, and we take it with us into these rooms. And, you know, when I'm thinking about the process and those, you know, plurality seats that are represented by Latinos, you know, the data will bear out what can be done there. But you have to, you know, we want to make sure that in those places where, you know, we have strong Latino representation that likely has grown, that their voice is recognized, amplified, if possible, you know, and made less vulnerable should the data support that. But I know that, you know, those communities will participate in the conversation. They will certainly make their case to the IRC, and the IRC will do their work in terms of presenting it to the legislature. You know, and I bear a great deal of confidence that, you know, with leadership like Dr. Cuevas, you know, Molina, that we are able to make sure those voices are preserved. And then, you know, and that will make our job very easy in the legislature if and when we just have to approve that. But, you know, her diligence is what makes it happen. And you know, we're going to be playing a lot of defense in a short amount of time, obviously, when we have so much to do in limited in a limited fashion. But we'll get it done, and I believe that.
No, and I would say that the commissioners we are very excited to see that we are, you know, part of the budget bill, that we, you know, are being included. We're being given a good amount of money to do this work, hopefully to, you know, like the best standards possible, right? And that this money, it is my hope, will be used just to reach the people, right? To give representation to New Yorkers, to give them a voice in this process. That's my goal.
And I can't help but like get butterflies in my stomach at that possibility that actually could happen and be used to actually draw districts, right? You know, this is a completely different legislature. It is a different process. In the past, LAT4 drew the plans, had the hearings, right? Listened to the people, perhaps not, you know, couldn't get around to the congressional. Let's be real. Democrats drew the assembly because they controlled it. Republicans drew the Senate because they controlled it. And then no one balked at each other's plans. It's just like, you be quiet on my end. You take care of your house, I take care of my house, right? Sounds to me like this independent redistricting commission, although appointed by the same representatives that now have to vote for a plan, you know, while it's called independent redistricting, the same way as right to work states or, you know, secure communities, those are all like a spin on the same words, but independent, still appointments by the legislature, still approvals, final map approvals by the legislature. So, you know, for everyone on this, you know, watching this, it's really important to understand those new dynamics and what role, and really kind of seeing the openness, Ivelisse, that's great. But I think as a community, we still need to continue to know that there are obstacles, there are challenges, there are real power bases that want to be maintained, sustained through the next decade. And we need to ensure that the voices of our communities are in fact, you know, front and center regardless.
Yeah, I want to remind people on this Zoom that the Redistricting Commission is advisory, right?
Right.
We are going to be doing this work of engaging the public and putting together draft lines and final lines to propose to the legislature. They are the ones who make the final decisions, not the commission.
Thank you so much for that. And that's the point I wanted to make sure that everyone was clear on. I want to invite the other panelists on because there are some questions that I think are much broader and I think warrant, you know, a broader spectrum of views on this. And, you know, one of the first questions is about gentrification and the fact that, you know, what is the data going to do? How is that going to take into account the growth, the gentrifying growth, you know, where Latino hubs, communities used to be hardcore majorities. And now with the non-Latino communities gentrifying those neighborhoods, we've seen it across the city. You know, how is that going to impact the drawing of seats, the influence? On the chat, we heard about Long Island, right? The influence versus majority, because we've been using those words, you know, and those things impact real projects that electeds get to create for their communities, right? And so all those things are into play. Carlos, do you wanna start us off with that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in fact, some of the biggest changes we have seen in districts that affect Latinos, Latino representatives, Nida Velázquez, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Richie Torres, these are districts that have been directly affected by quote unquote gentrification, the influx on the one hand of middle-class non-Hispanic whites, as well as the outflow of non-Hispanic whites, right? We saw that in the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez district, the majority of the decline in the population in her district came about because of the exit of non-Hispanic whites. Similarly, for Congresswoman Meng's districts, the decrease in population in her districts came out of the decrease in the non-Hispanic white population. However, there were increases in the non-Hispanic white populations in Nida Velázquez's district, right? With a compensatory, you know, with a decrease in both the Hispanic and the non-Hispanic Asian population in her districts. There was an increase in the non-Hispanic white population in Richie Torres's and Adriana Espaillat's districts, right? Even though they remain majority Hispanic. So that quote unquote gentrification, if we put it in both in terms of ethnicity and class, they're definitely affecting the role, they will have a role in the redistricting process, no doubt.
I mean, overwhelmingly, we've seen someone, and the argument is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, right, AOC, was not in fact elected. While there is a plurality of Latinos in the district, she wasn't really where we saw the votes come from. They weren't from the highly dense, you know, blocks where Latinos reside, and not necessarily wasn't the Latino community that put her over the top, but she was a candidate that was able to, in that district, you know, reap the benefits of a larger voter turnout and do that work. Curious, Cartagena, about the role that gentrification can play and the changes that we see in Latinos being elected in non-majority seats, right? And we saw that in the African-American community, right? In many ways. How does that play in now?
Well, most of the time it happens in the reverse chronological order. You get elected from a seat that's a plurality or majority and it becomes gentrified, but your incumbency has power and weight and you still get reelected. It's interesting that in Delgado's a very different issue because that district, I just read, I didn't know this, that district actually borders Vermont, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. Think about that for a second. And it's only 8% Latino. So he gets elected in a district that's completely different for different reasons. But the AOC example is a little closer to what your question is, and that is, she's getting elected from a constituency that's plurality, and it will be increasingly gentrified. So the short answer to your question is, redistricting is always front and center, anchored in residential segregation. If our communities are segregated, it will be reflected in redistricting plans. When our communities get gentrified, that mix of race and economic status will be reflected in these redistricting plans. At the end of the day, the districts follow these residential segregation patterns. So we'll see what it really means in terms of ability to elect. Do the communities that have been there for a long, long time, will they be able to turn out at rates that equal or surpass the gentrifiers and the hipsters? That's what it comes down to.
And Fulvia, do you think that, you know, I remember in 2000, the boom hadn't happened. I didn't see Ricky Martin or Jennifer Lopez having hit the scene as yet. It was about to happen. You know, I think it was immediate. I'm not kidding. This was a real thing. Immediately after Census 2000, that happened. And then we saw the articles about white flight, right? And the fear mongering that came out of populations, you know, shifting and the demographics shifting. You know, what can you tell those populations that perhaps, you know, don't have the same voting age population or citizens in their voting age population? What role can immigrants play in kind of helping shape a neighborhood and the way in which elected officials see these districts and the communities of interest and the demographics when they're drawing? They may not see voters and the electorate in the same way, but those are people with needs surrounded by voters with similar needs. And so curious as, you know, what can we get other communities to think about outside of the electoral voting power base?
Well, we also have to remember that redistricting influences more than just the elected official, right? It determines where hospitals go, where clinics go, where schools are, how many schools are needed in the district. So it goes beyond our elected officials. And so when if we want to move away from that phrasing, because some people may just reply, well, I don't vote, and that's that. We really have to bring home the point about what redistricting does for their community and why it impacts them on several levels beyond their elected official.
That's great, thank you. There is a question in regards to, and that is, you know, aside from the immigrant population, right, and potentially immigrants that do not vote, tons of immigrants that do vote, right, citizens already, but the assembly member, the question was around, you know, prisoners and their ability to vote. And I know, Cartagena, you responded to it on the chat, but the question is, what is the appetite within the legislature to ensure that, you know, voting rights are not removed from someone who is in fact incarcerated, and that they maintain their ability to elect, you know, even through incarceration? Curious what the conversations are in the legislature around that.
Yeah, I think there are a number of really good, strong conversations along those lines. And in particular, I can think of 2 or 3 bills that either look to restore voting rights to folks who are either currently incarcerated or immediately after being incarcerated, making it an automatic mechanism for folks to get to restore their voting rights. I hope it's something that we'll be able to take up this year. I think, you know, this is where you test your supermajorities and kind of make sure that, you know, you put principles out there that reflect people, one person, one vote, right? I mean, these are things that we talk about, that we say are the foundations of our country, but, you know, have no problem stripping away those rights, you know, and not restoring them even after someone has repaid their debt to society. So I look forward to hopefully dealing with that this year as we continue to move forward with voter protections and expanded ability for people to vote.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all the panelists that are on. I know that we're in the midst of potentially electing a brand new city council in the city of New York. We didn't even talk about city redistricting in any detail, but that's hot to try. And the fact that folks then have to run 2 years after the 2021 elections, I think people really need to pay attention to the outcomes of these races. who's running, race, ethnicity, you know, the issues and who's actually pushing these candidates to run, what the outcome is of the mayoral. All those numbers are going to give us a real understanding of what community of interest really means. And so don't take for granted that, you know, we have multitude of candidates running, but let's be real. We've seen it in the specials. Those numbers are going to matter. So feel free, Cartagena, final words, and then Carlos, take it from there.
Not so much a final word, but a final question to Carlos and the Centro. Great job in New York. All my colegas, my panas, my family, my staff members in Florida are saying, when are you doing this report for Florida?
We will. But in addition to doing Florida and Connecticut, I've gotten inquiries about Connecticut as well. We will also have to do the state legislative districts, the Senate districts and the Assembly districts. So, you know, this is the first of other briefings that we will be doing about redistricting within New York State and beyond New York State. Absolutely.
And I would be remiss if I didn't just say this, Carlos, but you know, Angelo Falcon is here in spirit. And I just thank you, Carlos and El Centro, for taking on something that I knew he would have wanted to be a part of. So thank you.
Absolutely, Lucia. Absolutely. Right on. Gracias. Thank you to our outstanding moderator, Lucia Gomez, and to all of our panelists, Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez, Commissioner Ibelis Cuevas Molina, attorneys Juan Cartagena and Fulvia Vargas de Leon, for their participation. This has been an outstanding event tonight. We have been getting some very good feedback in the chat feed. Before closing the program, I want to remind the audience that you can find this webinar and all of our previous webinars in the same page you used to register for this webinar, centropr.nationbuilder.com. And if you want additional information or resources from the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, you can access it from centropr.hunter.cuny.edu. You can also follow us on social media through the links shown on your screen right now. And finally, as you log off this evening, you will receive a prompt to respond to a very short evaluation survey. We will appreciate it if you would fill it in. And thank you again for attending and participating in this webinar tonight. Muy buenas noches.